We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the Darkened Hour.
Hello everyone and welcome to this inaugural episode of the Darkened Hour. My name's Richard Cox. I'm here with Adam Fitzgerald. Good evening, Adam.
Good evening, Richard. Pleasure.
Okay, so in this, we've got all sorts of interviews lined up. We've done some already, and I think we've got some really ones that certainly excite me coming up. But we thought it would be good to do an initial episode where we just lay out who we are, where we're coming from, and why it is we're doing this, why we felt that the crowded marketplace of podcasts needed yet another one, the world needed to hear our voices and input into these things. So that's what we'll address here. So the podcast itself is centered around 9/11 and the wider history and geopolitical implications of that. So Adam, this has been your major area of interest and study for the past, what are we talking, 13 years, I think you put it at?
Yes.
And that comes after actually witnessing the events of the day. From where you are in New York, you saw, I think, the second plane go into the building, right? So maybe you can start off by talking about that journey for you and what got you into researching it, and how you've come to look at the event and the wider world through that lens then.
Well, I was born and raised in New York, and on September 11, 2001, I was on my rooftop in Queens, New York, and saw the explosion of the Flight 175 into the South Tower. And at the time, while it was shocking, it was more in the way of bordering the surreal, and we had no idea about terrorism and international terrorism and sorts of things of this nature. It wasn't until many years later, in 2006 and 7, right, early 2006, where I started to delve into the areas of the geopolitical regarding September 11th. And what I saw, which was very perplexing to me right away on the internet, was that a lot of people were talking about the physics regarding how the towers fell. And nobody was really talking about the perpetrators or the intelligence apparatuses that were involved intimately with the attacks. And so I started to study these fields. And the areas I started to study were basically the intelligence apparatuses, Middle East affairs, the foreign lobby institutes, U.S.-Israeli affairs, U.S.-Saudi affairs, and religious fundamentalism. These are large areas to begin with, but I liked reading anyway, and I started to read multiple books upon these subjects. And what I found throughout the years was that 9/11 itself wasn't basically just about the day. A lot of people like to think that 9/11 is just about the day or the days into it. It really is a puzzle type effect, and it leads into years and years. And so I wanted to start at a certain time frame, and I started with the 1979 Soviet-Afghan War, and I worked my way from there, because from that position, that period of time, we start seeing the more notable figures starting to arise that were influential in the 9/11 attacks and beyond. And so I started studying these subjects a little bit more thoroughly, And it led me to what I am today. And I think the last 5 years have been more vigorous in my areas of study regarding 9/11. And it has a branch out effect. And I could talk about one subject about 9/11, talk about religious fundamentalism. When I talk about religious fundamentalism, I have to start understanding the culture of Middle East. What's the understanding of the Sunni-Shia divide, for example. Why is that important? The Israeli-Saudi connection, or the Israeli-Arab connection, and how they evolve. And that has a connection to 9/11 attacks as well. And what I say about delving into other areas, yes, you have to delve into other areas because it has a correlation with the attacks. And what is the Bajinka plot, the 93 World Trade Center bombing, and so have you, and have you. And the things we talked about in our year-long series, the Rose 9/11 series, that we touch on these subjects. The podcast itself, I would like to talk about the finer details of what we didn't get to in that series, and there's a lot.
Sure.
And that's where I think that I want to touch on in this podcast. And we'll talk about the details regarding the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the FBI, the Israeli Mossad, the Pakistan ISI, and so have you, because that is the most important topic regarding 9/11. It's not about the attacks themselves, but the intelligence apparatuses and the governments regarding those countries.
Sure. We on the when we agreed to the series, I thought we'd do about 6 hours of recording and go from the 1950s to 9/11, and that'll be it. And it just expanded and expanded and expanded as these things do. And eventually we said, okay, yeah, we've got to have a dedicated podcast for this to go really into the detail, because we've, in answer to my earlier question of why do we feel the need for another podcast, I think there is still a lot of questions that can be productively asked about 9/11 and certainly about the wider geopolitical sphere. Just a question on what you said there, Adam, in describing your entry into studying 9/11. Did you come into it from a particularly conspiratorial angle? Because the way a lot of people get into studying it is they'll think, like, they'll hear this idea that 9/11 was an inside job and then start to try and prove or disprove that. And but the way you describe it, talking about the study of fundamentalism and Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan and so on, it doesn't necessarily sound like that. So what was your kind of angle coming into it? Were you drawn to any of the conspiracy theories straight off the bat, or?
Actually, no. It started with when I started to study theology, especially monotheism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in the early 2000 period. I'd say between 2003 to 2005 or 6. And I went about it wrong because I was an atheist and I became a rabid anti-theist, and I just generalized. And I found out that my worldviews were the reason why, because I was biased against religion. I didn't know anything about, say, theology, real Christian theology. I just lumped all religions together. And I swore that I would never make that mistake in any type of study in the future. And it was because of my study into theology and talk about Islam and Christianity that I started to once again have a peak of an interest into the events of 9/11, only because I lived in New York and, you know, I lived through the event, but I didn't know anything about it really. I was very ignorant. So that's what led me. But I wanted to make sure that I didn't want any type of biases to go forward in my research. So I basically eliminated any type of biased worldview I ever had, and regarding like racism, religion, and politics. And I was already an atheist, and I wasn't much in the way of a voter, and I thought all politics are just a failure anyway. Democrat talk about bipartisan politics anyway, Republican, Democrat. And racism was just something that was easily eliminated in regards to social psychology, social construct, and the understanding of the individual, because racism is just about the degradation of an entire demographic, usually in detrimental terms. So that took a while because human constructs are ingrained within us from birth. And it's almost like a natural property, but they're all unnatural. Politics, racism, religion are taught ideologies. They're not natural in any spec. So that led me into 9/11 itself, and it gave me a clean slate. And I looked at 9/11 not through rose-colored glasses, but as a gray area, because there was so many more questions and answers. And it just
Right, so you didn't feel you were backing a particular horse from the get-go.
right, which helped right away.
Right. Okay.
Because
that's quite unusual. I think that's unusual.
well,
So-
well, yeah, I would agree with you, only because if you look at forums today and you look at other people from, say, the Truther movement, you'll see many competing ideologies, and they're all persuaded by their worldviews. Their hatred for Israel, or their hatred for Islam, Islamophobia, or their hatred for the state, the government, the fear, or the distrust, so to speak. So when they already have that worldview, they'll look at evidence or material that caters to their worldview. And luckily for me, I just didn't have any type of worldview. I looked at everything and just eliminated information through a process of careful research and study. Richard, what got you interested into the events of September 11, 2001?
I'd actually just left school, like in the June, I think. Okay, and so that was pivotal, because in the last sort of year or so of my school career, my faith in the establishment had been deteriorating. So growing up, I always believed that the world worked in a good and functional way, and politicians were there for, you know, the betterment of humanity, and the information you were handed in your classes was true, and so on and so on. I never had like a cynical attitude to things, and that just became really tarnished around when I was like hitting 17, 18. Things just kind of like fell apart for me, and the world was making less and less sense. My belief in the educational system was affected by like teachers who seemingly didn't have any interest in their subjects, and that was quite shocking to me, you know. And politically, the election of George W. Bush had quite an impact, right? Because it just seemed so strange to me that in a nation of 300 million people, I was like, gee, what are the chances that the job would go to the son of the guy who did it one time before? You know, that seems like astronomically improbable if we're talking about a democracy where everyone gets together and selects the best man for the job, right? And maybe it's like sometimes you have professional athletes and their children are really talented athletes, you know? So maybe the Bushes are just like this really politically superior family. And then he saw George and oh no, right? It's like you can't maintain a sense that the world makes sense when George W. Bush is held up as the leader of the free world. It doesn't make sense, right? So I was having this real conflict of losing faith in the establishment to provide truth. Okay, and I remember one pivotal thing was sitting in a history class and realizing that all the information I had on the world came from these books that the teacher would hand out. And I didn't know any deeper than that. I was like, well, these things could be made up, right? And I'm sure they're not, but I wouldn't know. And it troubled me that if someone had said to me, like, how do you know that stuff isn't made up? I wouldn't have an answer for that, right? And upon leaving school, I was in a bookstore and I saw a book called The Biggest Secret by David Icke. Okay, and it just grabbed me because it had all the faces of world leaders on the front, and I thought, wow, what is The Biggest Secret? And it's this real classic conspiracy book, I suppose, of like where reading the back of the back of it, Mr. Icke presents this entirely different view of the world. Okay, and a part of me is like looking over my shoulder to check no sort of secret agents are looking at me reading this, right? I'm not going to be carted off. And another part of me is thinking like, well, I don't, you know, obviously I don't believe this, but I wonder if it's even possible to construct an alternative theory of history. You know, like, can you do that? And does it hold up or does it fall flat? So I bought the book, and a lot of it was like, so I mean, just to say a lot of it was far out would not be going anywhere near far enough. It's the book where he broke the whole idea of shape-shifting reptilians to the world. Okay, but other parts of it I found very insightful. I found his commentary on a lot of societal structures, like, hey, yeah, that speaks to what I'm experiencing. So I felt a certain confusion over that. And then, really at the time I had pretty much just finished reading it, the planes went into the towers. And I remember I was on a works course that day. And for us, it was the middle of the afternoon when we saw it. Okay. And it was surreal, like, because we saw it on a kind of coffee break and then nobody knew how to react. So we just went back into the room and continued learning about word processors, which seemed like a stupid thing to do. And I just remember this overwhelming sense of like, the world has changed, right, on some fundamental level. It's never going to be the same again, right? We're living in a new world now. And also a sense of like, I don't know what this event is, right? Like, is it the event that the TV was then telling me it was over the next few days with Islamic terrorists, or is it the event that I'm finding out about on the internet in this strange new world of conspiracy? And that was the rabbit hole I jumped down, probably for a couple of years, right? But I have to say, it didn't really get very far because it was overwhelming for me. I would say I lacked the intellectual tools to take on a question that big. And this was like in the 2001 internet, where you just get articles and, I'd spend like maybe 20 minutes reading an article and then realize what I was reading was crazy or something, and like, so I was completely out of my depth, right? So I spent some time in that and then took a step back. And it was really about 2009-10 time that just a series of strange coincidences of people were coming up and asking me, like, oh, you used to be into that 9/11. What do you think about that in the end? Were the towers bombed, or was it all in the side, or was it not? And I just, I really don't know about any of that stuff. I did think it was, and I didn't, and so on. And I felt pulled back into it. I had a strange encounter with a woman in a bar who told me she'd been part of the MK Ultra program. I have no idea to this day whether she was or not. But that events like that kept occurring, and I found myself shifting back into what was this very probably at the same place, although I'd done a course in philosophy at the time. I knew how to construct thoughts much more clearly, so I jumped into the world of YouTube now and documentaries and so on. And after about a year of that, I felt like I just floundered around again. I hadn't really gone anywhere, and that's I stopped looking at the day itself. Okay, and I hadn't been doing this like super intensely, but I stopped looking at the day itself and thought, okay, whatever's true about the day, it's got to arise out of an historical context. Okay, it can't be that everything in history is the way we're led to believe, and then Dick Cheney decided to blow up the Twin Towers. That doesn't make any sense, right? If there's anything in these claims, this is something that must have been going on for a long time. And I started to read the history of US foreign policy, and the one that really got me going was Operation Ajax, the CIA's coup in Iran in 1953. And I heard about that on an Alex Jones documentary and went to check if it was true. And to me, it was jaw-dropping. I mean, it might sound very mundane to people, okay, in the audience, because everyone knows this kind of thing happens. But to be confronted with, like, there's no doubt about that. It's not a theory. It's not some conspiracy. Absolutely, the CIA overthrew the secular government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 and put a monarch and a dictator in charge of Iran, which eventually led to the descent into the Islamist state it is today. That happened, right? And it conflicted again with my childhood. I'd always, like, through childhood in the 1980s, Iran, my contact with it was through, like, the Iron Sheik, the wrestler, who would always have some dastardly trick to defeat the good American wrestler Hulk Hogan, right? And I didn't understand that geopolitics was playing out there, and this was all as a result of the embassy hostage crisis and so on. But I just was overwhelmed by the hypocrisy of the way Iran was presented in the Western media then, and then to find that this is a common pattern. You can go back to, like, incidents like the Maine and the invasion of Cuba and the Philippines, and forward through Guatemala and the Congo and on. The America is not the leading nation of the free world it's presented as. It's really an imperial power. So this is a complete revision of my view of the world, which in some ways is much greater than saying, is a particular event an inside job or not? right? It's not the specific, but it's the general context in which we're looking at the world changes. And then I suppose, what I noticed throughout this was that continuously you have imperial agendas which have no way of being carried out due to popular resistance, either foreign wars or domestic oppression. And then an incident happens, and the media instantly has a narrative presented for that incident, which allows the war to take place. Okay, so whether it's the war with Spain that came about after the destruction of the USS Maine, or whether it's in some ways the Lusitania contributed to shifting American opinion on the First World War, Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and so on and so on. And without going as far as saying like these were all inside jobs, because the Lusitania wasn't, it's a more complex story. I don't feel it was anyway. The Maine, who knows? But right up to 9/11, it's always this very coincidental juxtaposition of these events, right? That either they're being capitalized on or they're being set up or whatever. And that was my interest in false flag terror, in how it, but not even to restrict it to false flag, how terror in general is the lifeblood of the state. It allows the expansionist imperial policies to take place, and how human beings are goaded into violent actions they wouldn't commit otherwise through this. And that, kind of brings me up, to cut a long story short, to my eventual meeting with you, Adam, and that for me facilitated the ability to go into these areas in much more depth and come to a greater understanding. And I'm really pleased to be embarking on this podcast to try and, I suppose, make sense of the world and make sense of the violence humans perpetrate. Because I think even from being a little kid, that seemed like a ridiculous element of the world to me. There's something ridiculous about the nature of violence. And it seems to be like very unnecessary. Like I don't see the necessity of why Iraq is in tatters now. That doesn't seem like that was an inevitable portion of human history. And that if it wasn't for this issue we have with violence, the world would be in a much better state. And the populace at large might be the addict of violence, but the state is the dealer, the pusher, if you like. So it's my interest is in understanding that, I suppose, really.
What do you hope to get out of the podcast in the future? What do you see beneficial about the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd root it in understanding, right? I think if you go out trying to change the world, you're going to wear yourself out, because, who's the Greek guy that pushes the boulder up the hill only to have it roll down again? You're going to be that guy if you start trying to change the world. So I think like I don't have this great ambition that way. Because I think that will either happen or it won't, right? And we can be very cynical about the world changing, but then sometimes the world does change, much for the better. So, but it's kind of beyond our control as individuals. So I would hope to gain a greater understanding. And I do think that we're at a point in history where we've just had this thing called the internet dumped upon our laps. We see it as, it's been around 20 years now, but when people look back on this in 400 years' time, we are at the infancy stage of suddenly having access to this overwhelming amount of knowledge. And I don't think we quite know what to do with that. I don't think we know how to understand that, how to utilize that. And we go down these rabbit holes that are misleading sometimes. Or worse still, we end up like engaging in like entirely petty arguments about our point of view of like 9/11 was an inside job. No, it wasn't. It was this. No, it was a plane at the Pentagon. No, it didn't. It's who's on the plane. No, that's not relevant. It's all about the bombs. And people gravitate to the kind of behavior, we attribute to cavemen of like hitting each other over the head with sticks. And they probably didn't. They were probably more civilized, right? But that's what we use the internet for. And that's sad and depressing. So I would like, a good, honest and open dialogue, really, because I think that's what's missing a lot of the time with this. And then however that affects things, I'll just, I'll leave that to, the unknown outcome there. What about yourself, Adam? What do you see as being the role of it?
I'm hoping to see this podcast as an educational forum for those who are just beginning, and for those who are actually learned about the subject itself, that they can use this platform to espouse more knowledge about 9/11 in itself and the areas affiliated with it. I'm also hoping to have a better, more, if I dare could say it, enlightened public, quote unquote, an enlightened public more, because I feel that a lot of people, especially in the 9/11 spectrum, are just ignorant about how their country's government operates. And I find that to be troubling also for the future. And also the to find out about other people's governments as well and how they uh, coexist with ours for uh, geopolitical reasons only and not for humanitarian reasons. Because I think, especially with entities like the Central Intelligence Agency, they don't have the benefit of humanity in their primary frontal cortex of their heads. I think psychologically these entities don't really care about humanity as a whole, but for humanity to be used as like pawns in a chess game, and that they're the chess masters moving us. I think, hopefully, well, I'm hoping that this podcast itself will educate the public about, for me, it's the most important event in human history because, much like yourself and what you alleviated before, I feel that when 9/11 happened, the death of the world as we know it happened as well. Or as they say here in New York, the bravado or the innocence of New York was ended that day. To figure that, unite, because a lot of people think New York is this brash and a very confident city, and it was knocked down back to earth and never regained since that day. But I think the premise is far worse, and that what came out of 9/11 was far worse than what happened on 9/11 itself, and that it has a ripple effect toward the future, and I think forever. What I'm hoping also out of it is not to just to get an educated public, but to have a more motivated public to use the information that they learn from here, and that they spread that information to other people. And that's, I think, to me, that's the biggest reward of them all.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's a sense that humanity has a capacity to miss the really obvious questions, right? And to me, it's amazing that I should even be embarking on this, right? Because I think, why would we? All the big questions are surely covered, right? Because there's like $1 billion media industry, so surely they've sat down with the CIA director for 2-3 hour interviews, and it's been on all the channels and all the other people, and this stuff has been done to death, right? And yet we can pick out loads of people and think like, well, why did nobody ask that guy that question, right? And some of these people are amicable to coming on and talking about it, and it's amazing to me how we miss the obvious, right? How we really miss the obvious questions sometimes.
Well, I think that's the case, especially with the two congressional inquiries, the 9/11 Commission and the Joint House inquiry. And Karen Bright, I'm going to butcher her last name, Brightweiser, one of the victims' families, actually had a list of questions that they wanted to ask the 9/11 Commission, and that when the commission got the questions, only about, I think, 30% of the questions were actually addressed. And I think that's the case with both inquiries, that they had a lot of information at their disposal, which they did. They have millions of files they went through. But a lot of that information was either suppressed or redacted from public view, or totally ignored altogether by the committee themselves. So whether it was pressure from Philip Zelikow or the State Department or the CIA and what have you, and also the interviewees of certain people that committed perjury. Someone like George Tenet, the director of the CIA, for example, in regards to the cable regarding Khalid al-Mihdhar having a dual entry visa in the United States, in which he tells Tim Romer that Carl Levin of the Joint House Inquiry, where he states that nobody read that cable, but in reality, 53 agents within the Alex station read that cable. And and that's just one area. There's multiple areas where people didn't address certain questions, or they lied straight up. NORAD gave a false timeline to the 9/11 Commission, what have you. So yes, there was a lot of questions that remained unanswered.
Sure. So we have this really like solid stuff that you're addressing there. That's absolutely what we want to, the core of the podcast to be. I think also we'll digress away from 9/11 because I think a lot can be learned from looking at other areas of what I might label state crimes against humanity or something, and seeing how, whether it's events in the north of Ireland during the Troubles or the Kennedy assassination or something, that there have been movements in all these areas to gain the truth over events where people don't feel the stage has exactly been forthcoming. Okay, and I think there's a very productive exchange can be had there. And I don't know if there's anything you want to say about that, but just to mention the other thing on my mind is you've gone through a list of what I would consider to be the really erudite, solid issues that you can take to the bank and with regard to 9/11. You also have a massive conspiracy culture around 9/11, which at its more fringe elements goes into planes not hitting the Pentagon, a missile doing it instead, and then you get further along than that with holographic planes hitting the Twin Towers and so on and so on. And it's not always clear to me with 9/11 or any issue where the line is drawn between the reasonable and the fantastical. But this has been a massive diversion of attention, let's say, where we could say that whether it's intentional or not, whatever the intention is, conspiracy theory has come to form a part of the cover-up of these events, right? Because, and I think that's a statement everyone can get behind, unless you're the guy that is at the complete extreme end of the spectrum, where you think no one died on 9/11, even the towers themselves are holograms, and we're all on a flat earth. Everyone who's more extreme than you is in a sense aiding the cover-up with a fantastical narrative. And, I think that's something we'd perhaps like to touch on, of how do we address this? How do you go about studying something that's immensely complex when you're bombarded? Because it's all right if you've been in it for a while, but you step into something like 9/11 truth and you're bombarded with these million competing narratives, and everyone's calling everyone else a shill and saying their one is the right one. It's like walking into some kind of bazaar where everyone's trying to get you to buy their goods and telling you about the quality, how rubbish everyone else's is. And it's a very difficult landscape to step into.
I think dealing with the area of conspiracy, this is the biggest setback for the 9/11 Truth Movement, obviously. And I think it comes twofold. And it comes from an area of ignorance regarding the areas I outlined before, because they're so expansive, they're so broad, that people don't have the necessary time to read, whether they have jobs or families. They just don't have the necessary time to research and fact check what they read. So they rather watch a video, or they rather watch an edited clip. And most of these videos and edited clips that come from a truther point of view, or the fantastical point of view, I'll use that instead. From the fantastical point of view, doesn't really delve with factual information that you could check, because it's all based on speculation. But it fits into their preconceived worldviews, like what I talked about earlier. And that's why I think that's another reason that is a detriment in the both the debunker and truther party system, so to speak. And that these worldviews give them a biased view of 9/11. It could be any event whatsoever. And so because of people in the fantastical realm that purport these no planes or CGI mini nukes in the basement, Judy Wood's directed energy weapons, it also gives them a sense of having information that only they have. So they feel important that they have this information, but it's information they can't realistically purport in a conversation or a debate, because they would have to go about proving these assertions. So they're left in this fantastical point of view, and they become very combative, or they become very shut down in conversation, and very abrasive too, because you're challenging their point of view, their narrative that they learned, and they think this is as a weakness. So that's just one area, and I think it's basically in multitudes. There's also, because they purport these narratives, they're helping whether they realize it or not, they're the Central Intelligence Agency or the State Department sort of view that want no real inquiry into the 9/11 attacks. I mean, we saw that with the 9/11 Commission. They didn't want to fund it right away, and they just wanted to ask a limited amount of questions and whatnot. So you already have these entities that don't want any real investigation.
Sure.
And by these people purporting these fantastical narratives, whether it's on purpose, and I don't think a lot of it's on purpose. I think a lot of people are just misled and lied to. But what they don't realize is that the very same entities that they despise, they're helping by purporting these fantastical narratives.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the example that you give, I think is a good one. If you don't think a plane hit the Pentagon, you're not likely to ask questions about the CIA's relationship with the hijackers on that plane. Right. But I think this goes beyond just winning an argument, right? Because I think, I do think there's a lot of people in this, as there is in everything, who fundamentally enjoy arguing, and the sense of intellectual superiority that comes with that, of winning in your own mind at least. And I think we need to go beyond that into dialogue and into, because, sure, maybe there are people who are just out and out paid to present a certain narrative in the movement. But there's a lot of people, I think, like you say, who genuinely hold the beliefs they hold, overwhelmingly. I think that's the case. I've no evidence even the first group exists. So, how do you have a dialogue with someone who believes something that you really don't, and you might even think is detrimental, without it turning into an argument, and where you can go somewhere productive and say, okay, well, these are the areas where we disagree, but we can, still think that these areas are important. And that I think is really crucial. Something that's important.
Sure. Yes. I one thing I noticed that's missing after all these years I've been doing this for 13 years. And one thing I noticed that's horrifying, absent, is that there's rarely, if any, reasonable dialogue regarding 9/11. There's no reasonable debates, reasonable conversation. Any type of decent conversation regards just the physics, but even then it's a banter of back and forth, what have you. And that's another reason why I like to do this podcast, is that I want to use this forum to not just be an echo chamber, which, I don't wish to be purporting a narrative, because I don't purport any narrative, but just the facts presented. And whatever they lead me, that leads me to be. I want this to be a forum where we can dialogue with people of the bunker and truther groups, and then have a dialogue where it doesn't have a banter or back and forth or insult fest or what have you, why these people think this way, what is the logical premise in which they hold. And that's where I want to go with this podcast as well.
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting for me doing the interview series of you, because the premise of that was that I've not done 1/10 the research into this that Adam's done, and I'm probably exaggerating how much I have done there by saying it's a 10th. Okay, it's nothing like a 10th, but so the premise of the interview series was that I, as more of the layman, will ask Adam the questions, and if he explains it to a layman, maybe people out there can get it too, right? So I did enough research to know what questions to ask, and I found that very psychologically liberating, okay? Because there's no pressure on me to be a big expert in geopolitics then. So I don't have an ego to defend in this fight, right? And that's great, because, you can just, it's very freeing, right? And I think that's the angle you have to approach this kind of thing at. And because as soon as you start defining yourself as, I'm knowledgeable about this and that, it's such a complex and hidden area. You're studying something that doesn't really want to be known. Okay, the CIA don't want you to know their secrets. And I think we simply don't know. My sense is I don't know who's pulling the levers of power in this world, or even if anyone is pulling them, maybe they're just like you break into the cabin of the train and there's no one at the driver's seat. I don't know. And I think you need to kind of approach this subject of that kind of humility, and because otherwise it becomes like and we do see this, right, amongst people, like a war of egos quite a lot. So that's something I think we'd like to avoid here.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Look, I guess the most learned thing I've ever come across with 9/11 was that just when you thought you knew something about 9/11, you ended up not knowing anything about 9/11. And I'm a student, and I never consider myself an expert. And other people, like to say that, you're more learned than most. I don't think myself that way. I'm still reading books. I got, 5 on my nightstand over here to my left, and that's how I'm going to be even from years from now, 20 years from now, if I keep going. And what we need is to stop thinking of it as a context of the ego itself driven, and that the information in which you hold needs to be shared and echoed by the future of populations and the people that are listening and watching and reading. And what I guess the main goal of this podcast is that I want people, if they listen to it, is to get the information they gain from here, and that they themselves can become the teachers and the leaders, and that they themselves can echo the information that they learned from. And like I said, that's the biggest reward for me.
Yeah. So we probably should finish up just mentioning the title, right? The Darkened Hour, which was I did an article and your title was The Darkened Hour. I thought that's great. Really, as soon as you said that, yeah, that's the one. We're having that. So where does that come from in your mind, The Darkened Hour?
It comes from a bit of my own anomaly psychologically. I'm a hopeless pessimist. I don't see much in the way of a beneficial future or profitable future. I think we'll keep repeating the same mistakes and the same errors in the past, which it holds back to the old quote by George Santayana: "Those who are doomed, those who are forget the past are doomed to repeat it." Mm-hmm. I think that's what we're going to see in the future. But the Darkened Hour came to me in that regard, that when we talk about these subjects, there is no real light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, in regards to terrorism, the intelligence apparatus. It's all a detrimental and depressing subject. And I can tell you, through the 13 years that I've been reading, the areas that I study in, I'd say 95% of the information I've read is basically a depressing issue, and it really shaped my frame of mind to the pessimist I am. But not to say that you will become a pessimist yourself. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that light at the end of the tunnel is through the people using the information to educate others, and that hopefully that you'll have an educated, more enlightened public in regards to the dark spots of this country and this world. And those dark spots are the intelligence agencies and governments of each respective country, and that we need to shine a more global light and realize that the hegemony of this world is going to come from, not from them, but from us, the people.
I mean, one of the things I like about doing this, Adam, is I think you make me feel like an optimist by comparison, right? Because I think people are coming. I'm sort of dour pessimist, but
almost like a yin and a yang.
Well,
right?
I wouldn't say that, but a yin and a slightly less yin, maybe. So when you said the title, it spoke to me of yes, okay, it's an hour of going into darkness, because I think that darkness is the place we don't want to go, whether it's geopolitically or in our personal psyches. But darkness is also where real progress is made. I'm going to murder a quote by Jung now, where he said about enlightenment is not found by gravitating to the light, but by bringing our darkness into the light and exposing it. And so it spoke to me on that level. And also on the sense of the Florence and the Machine lyrics popped into my head of the day is always darkest before the dawn. And the little art I found for this was, the darkened hour, the darkest hour is right before the dawn. And finally, this sense of darkness also being mystery. And that's my overwhelming sense of, I think, most everything, but particularly the geopolitical arena, is that I have no certainty about it. This whole journey started for me with recognition that I believed I knew what the world was, and then I found I didn't, and it was all a mystery. And whatever I've learned since, it's never detracted from that sense of mystery. That my starting point is, I recognize I don't know how this world is working and how the pieces fit together and who's pulling the levers, if anyone, as I said. So that's the kind of the darkness of the mystery we can embrace and get away from our certainties and our pet theories about Zionists, Illuminati, international bankers, neocons, Muslims, insert here, whatever it is. And to that's the point we can all meet in that shared mystery, I think. So that's how it spoke to me on various levels.
Sure. It's almost like the book, The Inferno, where Dante is led by Virgil, his guide. And the way he got out of hell is he entered darkness through the forest, the proverbial forest, and he comes out to the light through Satan, through Lucifer, by climbing up to him into the world, into heaven, through the light. And I think the only way we're going to correct the issues of the past and the present, and to give a better future, a more enlightened future, is we have to reach the darkest recesses of our minds and to the others and the agendas and nefarious opportunists who have created this world, this machine world, so to speak. And to have a better future is to have a more enlightened public. And how do you do that? By going to the darkest spots of mankind. And that's why I came up with that, the title, The Darkened Hour, because we have to talk about the subjects that are not comfortable to talk about to get any real progress in the future.
Yes. Okay, Adam, if you're happy, I think we'll leave this inaugural episode there, and we will be back soon with an interview. So we'll be delighted if people subscribe if they want to hear more from us, and feel free to be in touch and send us your thoughts on this and anything we do. I think the art of this for us with the people we have on is getting really the right questions. So we're always open to help with that in terms of if we announce who we're having. It's great to hear from people and what they thought and so on. So
sure thing. And no, I think that's about it. And thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.